Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Houda Abadi, and I am the Associate Director at the Carter Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's conversations. This series gives us a chance to discuss our worldwide peace and health efforts within members of our local community. Before we delve into tonight's topic, I'd like to remind you that our next conversation is slated for October 24th. In it, we'll take a high-tech look at the center's fight against neglected tropical diseases. Those in the audience will be among the first to see 2 virtual reality videos shot in Nigeria by the Huffington Post. It should be fascinating, and I hope you'll join us. Tonight, though, our topic is on Islamophobia, in search of more effective strategies and solutions. Like all conversations in our series, it is being webcast live in cartercenter.org and will be later archived in the site. If you haven't already, please silence your cell phones. I'd like to also invite you to tweet about tonight's conversation using hashtag #RisingIslamophobia. You may want to submit your questions for the panel on the index cards that were provided to you. My colleagues will be collecting your questions around 7:15 p.m. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to my colleagues who have come from around the globe to discuss the Islamophobia industry and how best to counter in our closed expert workshop, which started yesterday and will be concluding tomorrow. But before I give the microphone to my fellow panelists, let me briefly introduce tonight's topic and state what we do at the Carter Center. Since 9/11, Muslim millennials have seen the words Islam and Muslims in the headlines on almost a daily basis. We find that post 9/11 war on terror, Islam has been unfairly demonized and Muslims stigmatized. Muslim youth in the West have grown up scrutinized because of their religion. Mothers have to make conscious decisions whether they could let their children watch news, in fear that they will internalize what they hear. They also worry whether their children will be bullied in schools because of their faith. We saw during the political campaigns that Islamophobic rhetoric was a socially acceptable form of bigotry. It was used for political ends to spread fear and garner popular electoral support. The rise of hate crimes against Muslims or people that look Muslim is at an all-time high. It came during a year marked by ISIS, or what I prefer to call it Daesh, atrocities on the one hand and anti-Muslim rhetoric on the other. The fact, though, is that the #1 victims of Daesh have been Muslims. On the one hand, Muslims have to confront the hijacking of their religion by groups such as Daesh, and on the other, they have to address the rise of Islamophobia. Muslims are caught within the spectrum of the vulnerable fanatic perceived to be at risk of being radicalized just because of their faith, and these are the bad Muslims, or asked to be the government's eyes and ears on the front lines to prevent violent extremism, and these would be the good Muslims. We really need to move beyond this very problematic binary. Let's take a moment to reflect on what this means in our nation. The Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security reported in June 2016, quote, "Law enforcement agencies in the United States consider anti-government violent extremists, not radicalized Muslims, to be the most severe threat of political violence that they face," end of quote. Anti-government extremists. Yet, the federal government just removed funding to organizations that work on these very issues. According to a recent poll by the Southern Poverty Law Center, the total number of anti-Muslim hate groups grew 197% from 2015 to 2016. 197%. In 2016, anti-Muslim hate crimes surged 67%, reaching a level of violence not seen since the aftermath of 9/11. In June, Nabra Hasnan, a 17-year-old girl walking back to her community mosque after visiting IHOP with her friends, was attacked and killed. The month prior, 2 men on Portland train were stabbed and killed after they tried to intervene and help 2 visibly Muslim young women. Unfortunately, we could go on. The list is way too long. Racism and Islamophobia are much more than just a sentiment or just hating those that look different than us. So then, what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is systemic and institutional. Islamophobia is the silencing of the Muslim voices. It is the selective condemnation. It is the constant, not so random checkpoints at random stops at airport checkpoints. Islamophobia is the travel bans. It is the surveillance of the Muslim communities. It is when even speaking Arabic, it is mistaken for an extremist threat. It is asking Muslims to apologize for crimes that they have not committed. It is calling for a Muslim registry. It is our senior politician assuring worried voters that Obama was not a Muslim, but in fact a very nice man, as if the two were mutually exclusive. And of course, Islamophobia is implicated in decades-long imperial wars inflicted on the world's most vulnerable populations. But please don't get me wrong. Islamophobia is not a Muslim problem only, or only a Muslim issue. It is a problem that affects us all. It's an affront to our common humanity, and it's as a human rights issue. Developing effective responses to the rise of Islamophobia has been at the core of the Center's project to prevent violent extremism since its inception. The Center believes that extremism knows no religion, national or ethnic boundaries. Daesh and Islamophobia are 2 faces of the same coin, and combating one means combating the other. They both perpetuate a clash of civilization, portraying the West and the entire Muslim community as being fundamentally divided along existential fault lines. Effective programs must be community-led and designed to respond to the strengths and challenges of the local contexts. Unless the root causes are addressed, violent extremism will continue to flourish. The threat posed by violent extremism requires a sustained response. And as a result of the Center's work with religious and community leaders, some of whom are in the audience tonight, local communities have implemented and developed almost 59 local projects to prevent all forms of violent extremism, including Islamophobia. These projects include media initiatives, religious outreach, youth engagement, and gender programming. Now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished panelists, all participants in our Countering Islamophobia Industry Expert Workshop. To my immediate right is Dr. Tariq Ramadan. He is the Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University. He is also Senior Research Fellow and Governing Body Fellow at St. Anthony's College and Senior Research Fellow at Doshisha University. Dr. Ramadan's forthcoming book, Islam, The Essentials, will be available next week in the United States. Next is Dr. Suzanne Barakat. She is a medical doctor, humanitarian, activist, and a personal hero of mine. Dr. Barakat is the sister of Deah Barakat, one of the victims of the 2015 Chapel Hill shooting. She chairs the Our Three Winners Foundations, a grant-making agency created after the murders to honor the humanitarian legacies of Deah, Yusur, and Razan. Last but not least is Dr. Deepa Kumar. Dr. Kumar is an associate professor of media studies at Rutgers University. She is an award-winning scholar and activist, a recipient of the Dallas Smith Award for her engaged scholarship and Georgina Smith Award for her work on gender and race equity. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. So my first question, Dr. Ramadan, is you've been thinking about the role of Muslims as minorities, particularly in the European context, for some time now. How do you see the current political moment, including the recent spate of terrorist attacks, the rise of Islamophobia, and the growth of the far-right ethno-nationalism in Europe? Is it a new moment, or is this a continuation of trends you've been working on for a long time?
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation, the Carter Center, and for organizing this discussion. As you have said, I have been working on this for now 30 years, mainly speaking about Muslims in the West and even speaking about Western Muslims, making it clear that the Muslims are now citizens. And I don't even use, there are two terms that I'm not using, minorities, because I think that there is nothing like minority citizenship. If you are a citizen, you're part of the nation, and you don't have to consider yourself as a minority. And there is another word that sometimes is used, is diaspora, which, see, a diaspora means that there is a center somewhere. No, I'm at home here, and as we are all at home. So this is something which is quite important. Now, we are facing something which is new as to the way it's put to us, which has to do with violent extremism and also Islamophobia. And I think that we have to tackle the two issues. So as I have been saying to Muslims around the world, we can't just not answer to what is happening. Some people are doing things in the name of Islam, and they are Muslims. What is our take on this? To say it has nothing to do with Islam, it's not possible. So we have to respond, to condemn what is done, and to say this is a distorted perception or understanding of Islam, and we have to say no to this, as we had to say no when it happened in the United States, or when it happened, by the way, not only in the United States or in European countries, because the people are very quick to say, I am Paris, I am France, but they don't speak too much when saying, I'm in Beirut, I'm in Damascus, I am Sana'a. So I think, no, I don't think that we have to, I don't love clapping. I like that when we think about something which is right to think about it. So this, I think it's important to respond to this. There is another thing which is important, Islamophobia and racism. And as we are not a minority and we are citizens, say, look, any type of racism is unacceptable, so stand up for your rights and say that this is not acceptable, not because it's against Muslims and it's a Muslim business. Racism is not only to be tackled by the people who are targeted. Black or racism against the black people is not a black business, it's our business altogether. So we have to be clear on this, that we are coming together. Having said that, what is important in the rhetoric today is that we are talking about it, and we can nurture a sense of reactivity and victim mentality. This is something which is very important, that we avoid the victim mentality, we stand up and we think about being part of the society in the United States of America, understanding something, that violent extremism and Islamophobia, it's against all of us as human beings, as citizens. And we have to stand up and to understand that it's not only a sentiment, it's a, people are structuring, and the state sometimes is structuring, and what we are dealing with is structural racism, is also instrumentalization of the rhetoric on war and terror to target people, as well as it was done against the black people in this country, it's now done also with the Muslims. So we need to understand the structure beyond the victim mentality and come together, because at the end of the day, if we are true citizens, the only struggle, which is the right struggle, is to stick to our principles and to say, not against our own society and not in our name. When it comes to do what we also do with people, because there is also something that I wanted to add when it comes to violent extremism, I will be the first to say that it's not acceptable. But I think that we have to come together and say, let us also talk about the reasons, the causes of what is happening in the Middle East, and not only say, blame the people who are killing innocent people and don't say anything about the foreign policy of the United States of America or the European countries. I think that this is not going to help us at all.
Just a very quick piggybacking on the question, on what you just responded, and I know in our closed session you spoke a lot about humanization and a common humanity, that it's not just a Muslim issue or a black issue, but it's a human issue. What would you say is the role of allyship? What should allies be doing?
Allies, you mean between fellow citizens?
In particularly when we're discussing Islamophobia, since this is the issue we are talking about.
No, I think once again, allies, you mean as citizens in the society.
Absolutely.
So what we have to do is to come together. Once again, I think that the situation is now very, very worrying about the fact that if we look at what is happening in this country, in the United States of America, when it comes to the Muslim ban, when it comes to laws that are taken against or stigmatizing Muslims, but not only, once again, I think that we have to come together, understanding that, you know, I have a very simple principle. Wherever we are, if we are true human beings, and if we work and we want to serve humanity, we are always on the side of the oppressed people and the people who are facing the structural racism or stigmatization or any type of racism. Islamophobia, it's a new type of racism. So we have to come together and to be clear that this is not acceptable. And as American citizens, we have to come together. Agnostic, atheist, Jews, Christians, Muslims, whoever you are, at the end of the day, if we are talking now and doing the job, it's just not to come as victims saying, you know what, we know that Islam is a problem. It's not Islam. Islam is not a problem. And by the way, Islam, for the Muslims in this country, it will be part of the solution, not the problem. So I really think that this is something that has to be heard by our fellow citizens, and we have to come together in the name of our shared principles, because at the end of the day, this is what should be the future of our countries.
Thank you. Dr. Barakat, you have seen the result of Islamophobia in an acute and a very painful way. How do you understand the growth of Islamophobia, but also how can we encourage Muslim youth here and in Europe to be proud of being Americans and Muslim, especially with everything that they have seen for the last 16, 17 years growing up and all of this hatred?
I think for many Muslim Americans in this country, there is a pre-9/11 era and a post-9/11 era. Pre-9/11, people didn't know what Islam was, and there was the fear of the unknown, and I was answering questions about what my hijab was, what did I believe in. Post 9/11, as many of my fellow Muslim Americans would share, there were, comments, I'd be waiting to go home from school and someone would be driving by and rolling down their window, I don't even know them, sticking out their middle finger and saying, go back to your home country. And I'm like, this is my country. I was born like 30 miles away from here. Someone is lost. So, going back to post 9/11, I've seen Islamophobia manifest in many ways. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I went to undergrad and medical school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Part of my rotations were rotating through rural North Carolina, where a lot of people have never seen Muslims, have never met a Muslim, and if they have, it was probably on television, and that is all they knew. So I kind of grew accustomed to the comments, the stares, the bigoted statements, refusing to shake my hand, refusing to have my medical care, yelling at me, attendings even wanting to have debates about religion while I'm holding a scalpel to someone's abdomen. It's a true story. The nurse told me afterwards and patted me on the back and said, you held your own really well. I was like, thanks for standing up for me. So most people have that framework, I would say, pre and post. But for me, there was also February 10th of 2015. My baby brother, Deah, age 23, was a second-year dental student at the University of North Carolina. His bride of 6 weeks, Yusur, 21, had just graduated from NC State and also accepted to the University of North Carolina Dental School to join Deah. And her baby sister, Razan, 19, who was studying architectural engineering at NC State, who was visiting them for dinner, had a knock on their door by their white neighbor who did not like the fact that they were Muslim. He had stated to them that he doesn't like the way that Yusr looks because she wore a headscarf. When Yusr was moving in with her mother, he had also made some comments to them, and Yusr's mom responded to her and said, "Be kind to him. With time, he will turn around." Now, unfortunately, what ended up happening is that he went into their apartment, into the comfort and safety of their home when Deah had just come home from class at the dental school, gotten off the bus in Chapel Hill, a safe town, a community filled with professional students, and was gunned down. Next, he proceeded to Yusr, who was standing in the kitchen to the left. She had a single bullet to the hip, immobilizing her, and then came from the back, per autopsy reports. Imagine reading them as a physician and as a family member, with the barrel of the gun against her head and to the back of her skull with a single shot. And then went to Razan, who, per 911 calls, was screaming for her life, and with a single shot to the back of her head, executed her. He came back on his way out, Deah in front of the doorway, with the 8th and last shot into his mouth, for a total of 2 in his head, 2 in his chest, and the rest in his extremities. I was on call in San Francisco, seeing patients in the Pediatric Urgent Care Center, and I flew home on a red eye, not knowing what on earth had just happened, and by the time I land, the police had released a report calling it a parking dispute. So that's kind of my experience of Islamophobia. Fast forward, I'm just getting on my flight to come here. Of course, I'm pat down in San Francisco airport. Even on my way to the White House, I get pat down despite going through an MRI machine and get swabbed for bomb material, because I am a threat, and they need to make clear that I could be hiding something in my hair bun in this sheer scarf of mine. And on my way, and I arrive into Atlanta airport, I have my infant child who I'm wheeling, and I'm on my phone distracted figuring out where I need to go next, and I'm in the elevator, and this kind stewardess gets in and asks me where I'm going, and I say baggage claim, and she starts tracing under the elevator button, says, "Train, this is going to the train," assuming either I did not speak English or I was uneducated, or likely both. This is my experience. Now, to the second part of your question, how do I be proud of my American and Muslim identities? I'd like to break down that question because I find it actually problematic to say, if I were a white Christian male, you would not be asking me how I reconcile my American and Christian identity. It inherently suggests that they are at odds with one another when they are not. The second part of or I should say the first part of your question, where you say, how can you be proud, is also assuming that I am ashamed of my Muslim American identity, and almost puts the onus and the blame and the ownership on me to do something. Whereas in the case of Islamophobia or any other marginalized group that is the recipient and on the receiving end of discriminatory remarks or behavior, we don't blame the victim. We make other people accountable, all of us accountable for those actions.
Thank you, Dr. Barakat, for sharing your personal story, which is very painful, and for being, to be able to share it with us. My question, the last one, I'm going to push a little bit because I think I'm gearing it more towards the youth. Youth that are, and I have 2 girls who are born here, one in the U.S. and one in New York and one in Jersey. And I have my 8-year-old asking me, why do they hate us in school? So these are realities that young Americans born after 9/11 face, not because they're not proud, but they don't understand what is going on in between them. Every time they open television, they see negative news. Without understanding, they internalize a lot of it and have a lot of questions. And a lot of young Muslims are looking up to you, and they see you as their own hero, Shiro. What would you tell these young American Muslims to be unapologetically Muslim?
Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is it's just really heartbreaking. I work in an underserved area with a large refugee patient population in San Francisco at the General Hospital, so it's the safety net for the county. And my panel is particularly I do refugee newcomer screens, in addition to naturally gravitating, towards a lot of Muslim patients who are underserved as well. And I'm in family medicine, so I see kids, I see adults, and the reality of Muslim youth in this country is beyond frightening. The bullying that they are subject to, that I have had to document and had to get attorneys involved as a medical doctor because of what they were being exposed to and being brought in for a medical visit that was resulting from comments that they were being called terrorists, they were being called Osama bin Laden, they were being told to go back to their home country, they were not eating together at lunch. I mean, these are very formative years for kids. And I think really what you're asking is, how can they not be fearful of the repercussions? And the honest answer is, in part, I don't know, because this is a very scary time, and we do have to be cautious. But on the same token, I would say that the way at least I manage and carry on is to be myself. And when you respect yourself, then people will respect you. And when you assert yourself, people will respect that too. And when you are proud of what you believe in and know that if you're standing for moral reasons and just causes, then no one can get in the way of that and no one can silence that. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Kumar, I think many of us in the United States, especially on the left, would like to see the recent Islamophobic statements and policies by public officials as an aberration and not reflective of the American political institutions or American citizens. But you argue that Islamophobia is deeply embedded in society. So how is Islamophobia in the United States connected to US intervention abroad? And how does adding empire to the discussion gives us additional leverage in understanding the Islamophobia industry better?
I want to begin by, first of all, showing solidarity with my sister here for being so brave and for standing up and speaking out despite going through what can only be described as a traumatic experience that take years and years to recover. So I salute you for withstanding it and being an activist and actually speaking out. And I speak a lot about Islamophobia. I've written about it. I normally don't tell audiences that I'm not Muslim, but I'm going to say this in this instance because I want to say that as a symbol of hope. That is to say, it is not just the people who are affected by anti-Muslim racism who have a stake in fighting it, but I think all of us have a stake in fighting it. When 9/11 happened, I'm a professor, there was a student who was beaten up, and the campus police thought, he's a Lebanese student, so what? Let it be. And some of us just thought that that was unacceptable. The climate that had developed, I was living in North Carolina at the time, the climate that had developed was so toxic that it just felt like anyone who had any conscience should stand up and do something about it. Now, my parents are Hindu. I grew up with Muslim families on either side. I've lived in this country for 25 years. But I grew up in India, a country of 100 million Muslims, and I know Muslims to be just like anybody else, right? There are good people, there are bad people, there are interesting people, and frankly, there's some really boring people. But the truth of the matter is you can't put an entire group of people into one category and somehow blame all of them for the horrific events of 9/11. And that's the climate, unfortunately, that we saw after 9/11. So I've spent the last 17 years speaking and fighting about this because I think what's being done is just horrific. And I hope that together we can stop such things as what happened to your family going forward. To your question, I don't think that Islamophobia, as you yourself, Houda, put it very eloquently, is just one or two politicians saying something racist or whatever. You talked about how it's in the media. You talked about how our educational system propagates it. And Professor Ramadan, who asked me to call him Tariq, so I will, Tariq spoke about how it's systemic, how it's institutionalized. So I don't think that we can see it as a sort of one-off thing. What happened to Muslims before 9/11, but certainly after 9/11, is exactly what happened to Japanese Americans after the incident at Pearl Harbor. As people know, the Japanese dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden, more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent, most American citizens, were rounded up and put into these internment camps. Why? Because there is a collective blame that is assigned to a whole group of people who are turned into a race. Now, as we know from genetic research, there is no such thing as race, right? But people get turned into races when human beings want to do bad things to other human beings, right? So there's a long history in this country. African slaves at first were just like white indentured servants. But then when they become absolutely essential to the plantation system, they're dehumanized, they're turned into property, and then they're written out of the Constitution, right? 3/5 of a man or what have you. Native Americans, there were Shawnee, there were Iroquois, there were all sorts of tribes, but they're turned into Indian savages. Why? Because their land was needed in order for westward expansion to take place, and they're turned into a race. And that's really what happened to Muslims in this country over the last 40 years, I would argue. Specifically to your question of empire. The term empire, my book is called Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, and I start all the way with the Crusades and go on to the Reconquista, which is the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and then to the era of modern colonialism in the 18th and 19th century, and then come up to the present. And I show that it's always been easy to go off and conquer other people's lands or to kill them or what have you if you have an enemy image, right? Because human beings naturally don't want to kill one another. You've got to dehumanize people in order to incentivize them to go and do these horrific kinds of things. And so I think the term empire really, the way I use it, is a nation or a group of nations that are politically and economically dominant, that want to assert their agenda over the rest of the world. How do they do it? Well, they do it by demonizing people. And in this case, I think US policy in the Middle East, particularly the interest in oil, has meant that an entire group of people have been dehumanized and have been turned into a race in order to justify bombing, in order to justify wars, and in order to justify the attack on civil liberties at home.
Very much. I'm going to start taking some of the questions from the public, and it's not towards any one of you, so please, all of you, can you chime in? What do you recommend to everyone that is here in the room? What can all of us do to help reduce and eventually eliminate Islamophobia in the United States? All right. If I know it's a very long, if we can be very short so we can try to read as many questions as possible.
I'm going to preface it with some context, and I think this might answer a lot of future questions. But growing up, I thought the answer was smile and be kind, because the reality was that most people never had met a Muslim before, and that this was my one opportunity to change their perspective, and I carried this massive burden on my shoulders to represent an entire faith that consists of, I don't know how many, can anyone quote? how many Muslims are in this world? I don't know. 1.5 billion, and there's no one else like me, so I only represent myself. So that was a challenge, and it was quite burdensome. And at times I wanted to be mean, but I felt like I couldn't, because even when people were saying derogatory remarks, because again, I was the one representative. Then when February happened, which is what I refer to this incident, I realized that smiling got me nowhere, and being kind alone got me nowhere. My family members were murdered in the comfort of their home, minding their own business, being model citizens, being academically inclined, being community service oriented. That wasn't enough, and it wasn't the solution. And it was important to speak up. And I'll enter here and I'll share that when they released a statement calling it, actually taking his words, the murderer's words, when he turned himself in and said, oh, I did it because of a parking dispute. They took his words without actually looking into anything. And later obviously found out that that wasn't true, but the media is a 24-hour news cycle, and parking dispute is the soundbite that gets picked up by the media. That's when I realized that, I can either sit in my room and cry my head off for the next 5 months before I can even try and, just realize that my life will never be the same again, or this is my opportunity to get up and speak. And we put together a press conference. It was on a lot of national media outlets, because initially it actually was not being covered even on local television. And there was a massive kind of community effort to push on social media to say, hey, why aren't you guys covering the murder of 3 Muslim American students? So there was the media coverage is one thing. And how to counter it? I think we have to reframe the way that we see it, because for a lot of you, Islamophobia doesn't directly impact you, and so you might ask yourself, why would I care and what would I do differently? But I think if we reframe it, as many of us have been saying in different ways, if we reframe it as a social justice issue, as whether it's racism or an act of injustice against someone who may belong or be labeled as belonging to a group other than your own, then, and in this case, someone who appears to be or is Muslim, then that is Islamophobia. And from a human rights standpoint, from a social justice standpoint, it's unacceptable, which I guess leads us to the next point that, I guess I'm taking more of my time here, but you don't have to ask me future questions, is basically to say that, I came back to work 2 months after this happened, and I was rounding on my patients. I was the senior on rounds with a large team of 10 people. And one of the patients at the very end said, this was right around the time that the San Bernardino attack happened, she gestured around her face and said, San Bernardino. No one said a word. And I was furious and livid. And, the trauma that I had gone through was just so traumatic that I was so easily triggered with anything. 4 days later, we're rounding on the same patient, and she says, your people are killing people in Los Angeles. And this is where I stood, and I looked around the room, waiting for my attending, my co-senior residents, my intern resident, my medical students, my social worker, my pharmacy student. No one said a word. And that's where I realized the importance that speaking up was not enough on my own behalf, because I was doing that. I was within my program where we're all social justice oriented and they know about my story, but that we need to stand up for one another. The same applies for me. And I have learned from experience, and this is kind of the little token that I want to try and give you all, that if and when you see something happen that is uncomfortable or inappropriate against someone else, then use that moment to say, hey, that is not appropriate, and to allow yourself to prime and think about what your next response will be. And actually, the day before I boarded the flight to come here, I was rotating at Kaiser in in a rural area in California for a single day. I was new on the site, new attending, literally had just gotten there, and the attending was like, let's go see the first patient. We're going to give him a knee injection. And I go in with her, and the patient says, where are you from, to my attending? And she was like, I'm from here. And he goes on, well, you don't look like a woman. You look like a man. And she says, well, I have short hair and I dress in effeminate clothing. He's like, no, really? Are you a woman? You don't look like a woman. And he pushed and pushed. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that I am watching this happen right now. And I had to remind myself in that moment, and I said, hey, that's not an appropriate thing to say. And afterwards we stepped out and she was like, nice to meet you, I'm Dr. So-and-so. That was a really awkward experience, and I told her, like, I'm really sorry that that happened, and let's debrief and whatnot. And she really appreciated that. She felt supported, even if the patient wasn't necessarily going to change his mind. So I say that as a lesson for all of us, that we can stand up for one another.
Do any of my other panelists have anything else to add?
Sure. Quickly.
Like some two very, yeah.
All right. Well, I'm an activist, and I've been organizing around Islamophobia, as well as anti-Black racism, as well as, the targeting of Latinos. And, in New York City, it's a equal opportunity harassment for anyone who's non-white when it comes to the NYPD. And so we form coalitions of people to come together to stand with one another. And I just want to give the example of the Park 51, or the Cordoba House. This was a plan to actually build a community center that housed a mosque, but was also going to function more like a YWCA or a YMCA. And the far right, Pamela Geller and others, decided it is unacceptable to have any kind of symbol of Islam so close to the site of the former World Trade Center. Never mind that there were porn stores and, all sorts of other things so close to the hallowed grounds, but God forbid you actually have, a Muslim community center. And so we got a coalition of people together, and we protested, and we actually drove these people out. And they were far fewer in number than we. And that's because people went and knocked on doors, and we held tablings, and we said, you know what, this is not the kind of New York City we want to live in. Immigrants are welcome here, Muslims are welcome here, and the bigots have absolutely no space. And frankly, most of them were from outside anyway. So we got rid of them, and Park 51 was actually built. So I raise that to say that there are attacks going on every day of this kind in every community and in every city. I think the thing to do is to keep your eyes open and to actually figure out, what can you do? How can you bring groups of people together to send a message to these far right-wingers that we will not tolerate their hate and their bigotry? And I think sometimes we can win, and it's important to win and to defend vulnerable people.
Dr. Kumar and Dr. Ramadan, you both alluded to it in the closed expert workshop and here on anti-Blackness and the relationship with Islamophobia. There's a question that asks, can you please discuss the link between Islamophobia and anti-Black racism, both integrally interwoven into white supremacist underpinning of the American experience and African-American Muslim experience both? Could you please talk a little bit about it?
Yes, I think that there is a link, and we need to have what I said this afternoon in our symposium, is that you can't understand what is happening with Islamophobia in this country if you don't get the right understanding of blackness and whiteness and the way African-American people and black people have been treated in this country. Because there are three things that are important. Is the way the history was built, the way structurally, or thought even, the history of the United States of America and the role of the black people, and this perception that there is a relationship of domination and stigmatization, and the structural reality within the country, which is structural racism is really the narrative, and the way it was structured in this country is something that is similar to what we see today with the Muslim presence in this country, targeting the people, structural racism, this sense of not one of us, alien to the narrative and the white narrative within the country. And then the last thing, which is also important, is just inequality and the perception that not only Islam is alien to the country, and as if blackness is something which is not part of the national narrative. Or if it is, in the way it is, it's not the reality of the American memory and the American narrative. And I would say here that what the Muslims should get, and the American Muslims should get, is that there is no way to deal with such issue if you don't get the big picture of what is the way the American narrative. And to get this right is not only to come back to Malcolm X and to say, look, it's deeper than that. It's old, what Malcolm X was saying, and in fact, the deep understanding that Malcolm X had was mainly at the end of his life, understanding that it was much deeper than only targeting the black people or white against black. It's something which is a structural reality within the society, which is stigmatizing the black people and putting the Muslim, so the Muslim within the same picture. And this is exactly what we have now. It's exactly the same narrative. And unfortunately, we have too many Muslims, they don't get that. They think that, oh, we are struggling with, it's against Islam, it's against only Muslims, and they don't get the structure of this domination and even this oppression and this stigmatization of Muslims. So I would say that this is what we need to get now. And it comes back to the discussion that we have now. Because at the end of the day, if we are serious about the future of this country, and by the way, I'm talking about the United States, but we are dealing exactly with the same problems in Europe and in the West, is really first to get informed. What is missing is knowledge, is to know what is the story, is the history of this country. Is something which is very important, to get more knowledge, to be informed and to inform. But I would say also something which is important, because all what you said is to stand up, to be courageous. I still think, and this is what you said, kindness is not enough. Kindness is essential anyway. It's not exclusive, but it's essential in our daily life. It's essential to have a sense of to be kind to one another in our daily, but this is not the solution. This is something which is not disputable. My main point here is that what we are missing in the whole discussion today, it's not only this, it's having courageous citizens. It's a question of standing up with courage, meaning what? If we are serious about racism, we also have to deal with the reasons. Who is playing with this? Who is imposing this onto us? Why is it, for example, in our school system, in our social structure? It's there. At the time I'm talking to you now, you have black people who are in jail and treated in a way, and they are innocent as much as you are innocent, but they are in jail. We are lecturing the world about human rights. They are in jail. Barack Obama came to power telling us Guantanamo is going to stop. It's still there. 8 years in Guantanamo, and we know, as you know, I know, they are innocent. They haven't done anything, only to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And they are in jail. And we lecture the world. Where are the citizens who are courageous enough to say, I'm going to be against whatever is going to happen in Syria and in Iraq against the violent extremists, but I'm sorry, I can't keep quiet before my government, my own government, spreading this violence elsewhere and telling us, condemn the violent extremists and keep quiet about our policy. I'm sorry, that's not going to work. So I think that, and it's exactly the same with the black people in this country. I'm sorry, it's very nice just to celebrate Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And they say after they passed away, after they were killed, and They are not here. The symbol is not longer here, but the system is still there. The structure is still there. So I think that we have to understand it's exactly the same logic that we are facing now. And instead of having Muslims on one side and black people on the other side, and even having some Muslim leaders not being able to say we are on the side of Black Lives Matters because the black people are saying that's not acceptable, let us come together. Let us come together and to be serious about this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pick up a thread of what Tariq said, which is imprisonment. As people know, the US imprisons more people as a percentage of the population than any other country on this planet. And this system is known as the carceral state, right? And in fact, since the 1970s, actually with Nixon, we've seen a war on drugs where, you know, as people have analyzed, essentially the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement represented a threat to the old order. And the way it was discussed was as a law and order problem, right? Civil disobedience is a law and order problem. So let's throw these people into jail so that they never again challenge the status quo and ask for more rights. And God forbid, you know, MLK was part of the Poor People's Campaign, asked for economic redistribution and so on. And so this was the method, is to criminalize, to demonize African Americans as drug dealers, as drug pushers, as criminals, and so forth. At the same time that this is happening, Arabs and then later Muslims are being turned into terrorists, right? Before the 1970s and 1980s, the idea of terrorism actually didn't exist very much in this society. If you look at, there have been, many people have analyzed the New York Times. Terrorism as a term didn't even exist in its index before the 1970s, right? But there's been a process by which this terrorist threat has been created as a way to justify policies abroad and as a way to strengthen the national security state. Particularly in the 1980s, the war on drugs and the war on terror at that moment are happening at the same time. And the question is, this is morally reprehensible, but I think as citizens, even if we're not black and even if we're not Muslim, we have to ask the question of what are the priorities of this society, right? If you look at the top killers of Americans, right? You go to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the 10 ways in which most Americans die are heart disease, cancer, traffic accidents, you know, automobile accidents, suicides. There's been a spate of suicides over the last, since 1999 and so forth. Terrorism doesn't even make it to the list. And yet, trillions of dollars are spent on the war on terror, supposedly to keep us safe. And we have to ask the question, why is it that we don't have a healthcare system that is free, that can actually stop the hundreds of thousands of people who die from preventable diseases? Diabetes, my God. You know, there's no reason for people to die from diabetes. They could get the kind of preventative care that they need to live meaningful lives. We could stop the tens. Last I checked, 42,000, primarily white, middle-aged, working-class people had killed themselves in this phenomenon that is known as deaths of despair. Why? Because they've lost their jobs. They can't have meaningful relationships. Why are those trillions that are spent on the so-called war on terror not spent on creating good jobs for all people so that 50,000 people don't kill themselves each year? Those are the kinds of questions that our media system and our political culture don't ask us to think about. And I think it's important for us as citizens to not just have empathy and sympathy with those who are targeted, but to understand that we all suffer. We all suffer when we give our consent to these projects of racial control. Because at the end of the day, if we took that $5 trillion that have been spent since 9/11 on the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, we would be living in a society where the vast majority of people would be a lot happier. And I think we have an interest in fighting for that kind of a society.
Thank you. One of the things that you've mentioned in one of your interviews, and it's directly related to some of the stuff you've been talking about, is the two forms of Islamophobia. You spoke about blatant Islamophobia, but you also spoke about the liberal form of Islamophobia. Can you a little bit discuss that and how can we counter it?
I mean, I think it's very recognizable when someone is a blatant Islamophobe, right? When Ann Coulter says we should invade their countries, bomb their countries, and force them to convert to Christianity, kind of obvious that she's a bit of a racist, right? Or when, Donald Trump says we should create a registry and we should have all Muslims. By the way, there already is a registry, just so you know. It's been happening for the last 15-some years. That's racist. When he says we should, he's extended the ban, right, the Muslim ban, and he's included other countries. When he says we should ban all people from 6 Muslim majority countries, that's obviously blatantly racist. And by the way, even the Libertarian Cato Institute has shown that not one person in the last 25 years who has come from those 6 Muslim majority countries is responsible for even one terrorism-related death, right? But we'll keep them all out because they're such a huge threat to our safety and so forth. So when people like that make these sort of statements, it's obvious that they are Islamophobes. But the kind that we don't recognize is when it's subtle, when it is not very clear that this is racism. And that happens when an entire group has been created who is somehow asked to take responsibility for the actions of the bad apples, the bad Muslims, right? And unfortunately, I know today that, with Donald Trump in power, people look back with nostalgia at President Obama. But let's face it, President Obama took all of Bush's war on terror policies and deepened them, right? He actually accelerated the amount of drone strikes. He increased the number of countries where drone strikes were actually carried out. Under his presidency, he also, this was something that the New York Times actually covered. The reason why there were so few casualties from drone strikes is because all military-aged men between the ages of 18 and I think 50 or something were considered combatants. So there are no casualties, right? There are no civilian casualties. The security state, the surveillance state has been deepened, et cetera, et cetera. But if you listen to the language of Obama after the San Bernardino incident, what does he say? He says, well, there are some bad elements in Muslim communities and all Muslims should take responsibility for it. That's a problem. Because after Timothy McVeigh, Irish Catholic, right, of Irish parents, and we know that the IRA is certainly responsible for all sorts of violence and so on. Did anybody say all Irish Catholics should take responsibility and, apologize for it? No. Do we, for instance, say, Sicilians who are part of the mafia, who commit violence, all Italian Americans are responsible for that? We don't. And that's the problem. That's what liberal Islamophobia looks like. It's not as blatant, but there is still a collective association somehow of all Muslims with the acts of the people who, frankly are doing things that, as Tariq said, are un-Islamic, but in the name of Islam. So I think that very often, shows like Homeland, very entertaining, but these are shows that have very subtle ways of demonizing Muslims, and we have to learn how to read and think in more critical ways.
So I have many questions on media and the role of media, so I'm going to ask one of them. So much of the internet information about Islam is coming from a biased agenda. How do we help people find good, trustworthy information to learn and share? And Dr. Barakat, especially with your experiences in working with the media closely, what would you say?
I'm going to use the word heartbroken again because I kind of understood that there's a difference between Fox News and CNN. But after February, I realized that I was dwindled down to a soundbite that wasn't even researched. And I was like, is this what you call investigative journalism? And am I just feeding into your narrative that given that a white man who murdered 3 Muslim kids, you're saying that he did it over a parking dispute? Or sometimes at the end, he's always a lone wolf, right? He either has a mental illness or I wish it were funny, that's what you see every single time. There wasn't any investigation done before they'll say, you know, okay, let's wait and hear it. What ethnicity or what race is this person? We will automatically know what they're going to call it. If roles were reversed and a Muslim-appearing person or brown person had walked into the safety and comfort of a home and killed 3 white American kids, college kids, what would we have called it? I'm sick and tired of that narrative, and it's not fair. Craig Hicks terrorized my family. He was ideologically based in his hatred. That, in my book, and according to, I think, Merriam-Webster, is terrorism. And yet, every interview that I did in the few hours post the worst trauma that you can ever put someone in, so they're talking about this being a parking dispute. What can you tell us in the 30 seconds that you're on live television? I can't tell you the frustration that I felt that in these 30 seconds I had to clear the names of 3 family members and try and share their legacy and to tell people that you've got your story wrong. And so going through that experience was actually very, very traumatic for me. And what do? I think social media is very powerful, and using that collectively is important. The community kind of moved together to push and get this story noticed. But honestly, right now it's realizing that Islamophobia is not just a racist person saying something, but it's actually an institutionalized, systemic, and massively funded phenomenon is somewhat beyond comprehension, I think. And it took me going through this experience to realize just how deep-rooted it is.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I think that there are many things that we have to do, and I think that the way we are present and the way we speak out, this is something which is essential. The first thing that there is a great deal of ignorance, and we have our responsibility in this. Just for example, you were talking about the last book. Penguin came to me, Penguin in the UK, telling me, you know what, we were looking for an introduction to Islam, and really there is nothing that can just respond to the questions of the people. And I think that we have to write. We have to write more and to be visible within academia, and within the civil society. We have to be present. This is one thing which is important, which is to spread knowledge, but not knowledge in the way. And this is why the problem is that when we speak about, so there is a space where we are not dealing with the media, we are dealing with the society, and we have to spread knowledge. Now there is something which is coming from the media today. And the media are interested in the problem. 99% of what I'm doing with the media is always to speak about what is not Islamic. It's not what is Islam. We don't speak about spirituality. We don't speak about values. We don't speak about philosophy. We don't speak about the added value of our presence. It's just, tell us something about you, because you are perceived as a problem. So tell us something about you, our problem. And I think that this is where it's very important for us to be much more present within the media, and also to try to think about a presence which is not only obsessed with the mainstream media that are covering. My point is not Fox News and CNN. It's much more to think about the local dynamic. In the local, you have some journalists, you need to, so the media, the social media are important, alternative media are important, but not the mainstream media. We need to understand that even us at the local level, being involved with the people and working is also something which is changing the perception of the people. And I would say that something which is sometimes the more important thing is that I am always saying to Muslims, please stop talking too much about Islam and be present as Muslims. Meaning, no, but it's not just not words, it's really to be involved within the society as citizens and to be involved in something which is a social dynamic, dealing with all what we are talking about, which is changing perception. Let me tell you something which is very important. The way I see it, the media and some of the people who have a target and have an objective against the Muslim presence, they are stronger and stronger now because they can see that at the local level, if you look at the local level, perceptions could change, and not for the worse, it could be for the better. And things are moving in a way which is, yes, we have this media and things, but at the local level with our presence, so I think that the media are working with a very specific, some of them have a specific agenda, we know that this is happening, but I think that we have to look at the way at our level, spreading knowledge, dealing with our fellow citizens, trying to use the alternative media. This is something which is essential. And then not only to be reactive and say, oh, I'm going to speak about Islam. Let us come to some of the common values that we have that can change the perception of the people around us.
My own approach really is to talk about history. And to point to how these things have happened before, and that the way that the media are covering particular issues have certain patterns. So for instance, one issue that is now common sense is that all Muslim women are oppressed. If you look like Suzanne and you have... Sorry?
That was the next question. You are
that was the
ready
next
on
question? Okay, great. If you wear a hijab, if you wear a burqa, if you wear a niqab, you must be oppressed. Now, I'm not going to say that, women in Muslim majority countries don't face oppression. Of course they do. Just as women in this country face oppression as well. Women all over the world are treated as second-class citizens. But the experience of being treated like second-class citizens is different in different contexts, right? So for instance, we have had women heads of states in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in Pakistan. We are yet to have a woman head of state in the United States. We have, what's called honor killings. I do not like that term. It's when a family member or an intimate partner kills a woman in Pakistan. The figure is roughly, the last time I checked, about 1,300 per year. In the United States, a report that just came out, about 1,600 women were killed by boyfriends or husbands in the last year. So in other words, this is not something that happens there among those backward, barbaric people. This happens everywhere because women are subject to physical and emotional violence in every country in the world. So I think it's important for us to really get a sense of how it is that we have come to accept a certain ideology that we in the West are superior, we are enlightened, our women are liberated, and we need to go off and bomb those women, right? That's what one of the justifications was for the war in Afghanistan. Let's go liberate them by killing them, right? Let's go drop bombs on them and so on. We have to recognize that that's not the first time that that actually happened. In fact, you look at history, and I think history is a very useful guide. You look at the English occupation of Egypt, and you see Lord Cromer, who is this great champion of Muslim women's rights, and he says, everyone must remove their veils, and this is how women are going to be liberated, and so on. Who is this great man? Well, he happens to be none other than the founding member and president of the Men's League to end women's suffrage in Britain. So there you have it. Here is this guy who does not want equal rights for women in English society, right? At that point, this was Victorian society. Women were the property of men. They didn't have the right to own property, etc. They were pretty much the property. He didn't want women's rights there, but it was useful to show how enlightened and civilized Britain was to go off and champion women's rights in the colonies. And so I think that history gets played again and again, and this is where liberal Islamophobia, liberal imperialism, which is the use of liberal ideas like democracy, like human rights, like women's rights, and so on, are exploited in order to put forward imperial and colonial aims. And if we know that history, we won't fall for that again and again. Dr. Barakat.
I just wanted to add one more point regarding media. We often think about it just as the news, but as you know, Hollywood is actually really huge in contributing to the implicit biases that define Muslims as terrorists. And I would give you an exercise to say, scroll through Netflix and pick any show that you want, and if there's anyone with an Arab, South Asian sounding name or is brown, what are they cast as? They are the terrorists, right? Any show that you want. And that inherently is incredibly problematic because we are social creatures who are creatures of experience, and this is what is being fed into our subconscious to be fearful of the other. And that leads me to the point that I think, you know, I've had to ask myself very serious questions in the aftermath of the trauma. You know, what is the purpose of life? Why did this happen? And I really had to ask myself, like, how can anyone have so much hatred in their heart to commit such a violent, gruesome, vile act? And the closest answer I could find was the following kind of formula, is that when we otherize people, we dehumanize them. Once you dehumanize them, you can justify anything against them, including violence. So this can be applied to wars abroad. This can be applied to minority groups that you don't belong to. This could be applied to oppressed groups who don't have a voice. This could be applied to the marginalized, vulnerable patient populations who are homeless in our cities. Whoever you apply it to, all of a sudden they are deemed less worthy. You are dehumanizing them and therefore not seeing them as worthy of the same rights and love, dignity, and respect that you do.
You're absolutely right in terms of especially your comment on media not looking at it only from the news, but also as our pop culture and Hollywood movies. With that, I wanted to just acknowledge Dr. Shaheen's work, who studied Hollywood movies, and he summarized it and he said, it's the 3 Bs. If you look at Muslims or people, Arabs or Muslims in Hollywood, it's either the belly dancer, the bomber, or the billionaire. And so you can only imagine the perceptions, unfortunately, that we face. So thank you very much for an intriguing discussion that is affecting us all. Thank you for equipping us to stand against hate and inspiring us to wage peace in our own local communities. Thank you so much. Thank you.